The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Randy Ironstache Bryce on why we need more working people in Congress. Tori Taylor on the Swing Left campaign to restore democracy up and down the ballot. Plus, Bill Press with pollster Peter Hart on what Americans want in the midst of a crisis. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight, and follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Former iron worker and congressional candidate Randy Bryce is on a mission to recruit and support working-class congressional candidates. He says working people bring a powerful and much-needed voice to politics. And we say hello to Randy Bryce, an American iron worker, activist, and former political candidate. He was the Democratic Party nominee for Wisconsin's 1st Congressional District in the 2018 midterm elections. Randy Bryce, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure to spend some time with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely. The pleasure is ours. Last spring, you launched a PAC to help get more working-class candidates to run for office. Tell us about the work of Iron PAC.
Well, after I was through and we weren't successful with our election, we wanted to keep moving ahead. It's often been important for me. I look at candidates, not just what they did before they decided to run for office, but what they did if they weren't successful. Are they still really involved in workers' issues or things that are going to benefit, or were they just doing it to further themselves? So I decided we're going to take what we built up. We always referred to it as being part of a movement, not just an election. So we took the resources that we had and the contacts that we had and turned them into what we called Iron PAC. And that was designed to help progressive, more working class candidates run for office throughout the country. And we were able to, help raise some money for like J.D. Iowa, Amy McGrath in Kentucky. We sent something out for Jamie Harrison as well in South Carolina. Just some really fantastic candidates that are either progressive or have somebody, like a real, I don't want to vilify him in a certain way, but just somebody that really is doing horrible things legislatively, whether it's like a Lindsey Graham or a Mitch McConnell, helping people get more resources to that. Because, the truth is that there aren't a lot of places that progressives can reach out to get resources. Usually it's, which I found out early on, it's hard to get support just walking off a construction site. And I think that that's a problem with politics today, is that we don't have enough people like us in positions representing us.
Mm-hmm. And, if more working class people made it to Congress, that would likely mean fewer millionaires. In general,
right.
How would greater economic diversity in Congress change what they do?
Well, if you take somebody like one of my favorite people right now is Congressman Mark Volcan, and Wisconsin's lucky to have him. He's one of 3 building trades people as a member of Congress right now. He's from the Painters Union. And if you look at things that he's been an advocate for, he's co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, which has just become such a powerful coalition and a force for progressive policies, for things like Medicare for all, for working families' needs, for things that working people need. He's been there. They've been able to build themselves into quite a force. And when Nancy Pelosi was elected Speaker of the House, it was to the point where he was able to go and talk to negotiate and get some power, to get some chairs on on committees as a result of supporting her. And everybody won as a result of it. And so I think the big thing is just understanding where you come from and what issues you faced getting to where you are, and just being true to the people that got you there. And I think nobody better personifies that than Congressman Mark O'Can.
Now, in terms of specific policies, where can working class lawmakers make a real difference?
Well, I think you could see things, just looking at the budget. What's important? Are we going to stop spending so much on weapons of war? If just looking at how much we spend compared to, the next 10 countries that are right below us. Instead, we can do things to help working people, to provide, better health care, do things like subsidize our own steel. Let's build our own products, make things in America instead of shipping these jobs overseas. Our infrastructure, right there is a fantastic thing that could be taken care of. Let's use part of our budget to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. That's not only did it put so many people into the middle class and provide an enormous amount of jobs and economic opportunity for people when we initially built our infrastructure, but it turned us into a superpower. And the lifespan of those projects were 50 to 75 years. And that's, do the math. That was 50 to 75 years ago, depending on what bridge we're talking about. So we could get people back to work, and also make sure that they're union jobs, and let's see some legislation that makes national right to work something that can't happen, and make those union jobs, because that's when our middle class did the best, was when we had the highest union density.
It shocks me that infrastructure is such an issue that, everybody needs it. Everybody is a part of it, and yet we can't seem to come together and get something done. It's crazy.
It is. And that was one of the things when Donald Trump was first elected. He brought some of the building trades presidents in and started talking about doing the infrastructure. And I was like, you know what? If he can pull this off, it's going to be very difficult for anyone running as a Democrat against him to knock him off that pedestal, because that would have been a way to put everybody back to work that needs a good job. I didn't like the way that he was planning on going about it. But the fact is if he would have done that, we'd have a much more difficult time right now trying to elect a Democrat to take his place.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as we established at the top of our conversation, you ran for Congress in 2018, didn't win. This was a high-profile campaign that got a lot of national attention. What did you learn from that campaign that could help other working-class voters?
Well, that's one of the things that we're doing with Iron Pack, and we're getting ready to relaunch it in the near future too, as a rebranding process that will. Its goal is going to be to help union people run for statewide office, in addition to what we're currently doing. But one of the things I learned, we got support from all 50 states, and I still have shoeboxes filled with letters from people. There was a real hunger for working class candidates to run. And part of it was that we had such a supervillain, if you will, in the political sense, somebody like Paul Ryan. But just the fact that, I literally walked off a construction site and decided to run for Congress. And people saw that. And it was, some people thought it was a brave thing to do, or other people thought it was a crazy thing to do. But there was a lot of support, and it was a genuine hunger that even now, as I'm doing some traveling, people are thanking me because I'm talking to a lot of city council people or other people that belong, working class people that saw what I did and decided to run for office themselves. And that's, it's very humbling when I talk to somebody and they say, you ran such a great campaign, and I was so inspired that I decided to run for office myself. Or somebody thinking about running for office. And, they're like, I don't know if I could ever do that. And I was like, of course you could. who better than you to make these decisions? Who do you trust more than you can trust yourself? Casting a decision on behalf of your neighbors, your mom, your dad, your sons. So it meant a lot. And like I said, and was mentioned, we weren't successful. We didn't get enough votes to win the election and have a seat in Congress. But for me, we ran that campaign as part of furthering a movement. And in that sense, we were able to find send Paul Ryan to look for another line of work and get the third most powerful Republican out of Congress, because he saw what the voice of United Working People was capable of doing. And people seeing how others can come together and unite and raise a voice is a very powerful thing and very badly needed at a time when, income inequality is a real issue.
I said you ran for Congress and didn't win. You may not have won the seat, but I don't think that you lost.
Correct. Thank you. Well put.
And that's exactly what this is about. Republicans and Democrats, they have long battled for the working class vote, and much has been made of Donald Trump's success in doing that. How do you understand Trump's appeal to the working class, especially after almost 4 years?
Right. He knows what to say, and that's that's the issue. Is we need to make people scratch a little bit, to kick the tires on the car, if you will, to find out what's under the surface. Because that's one of the reasons why I was so strongly in opposition to him becoming president, because I personally worked with guys that were on a project of his. And being a small contractor, he had issues paying them on time, and it was dragged out. Meanwhile, the small business has to, they have to make payroll. If you don't, the union would call them up, and how come our members aren't being paid? Sticking up for the members as they should. But it wasn't the small business's fault that they couldn't make payroll. It was the Trump organization that wasn't, that was trying to save as much money as they could. Trump got to where he is by taking credit for other people's work. And he knows what to say. He's talking about we need to rebuild our infrastructure. So it sounds good one day, but what does he do about it? He's all talk and no action. And that, in addition to the fact that just about everything that comes out of his mouth is a lie, when he's talking about no jobs are going to leave the United States, when that's just not true. He's good at talking, not so good on following through.
Mm-hmm. That may be the understatement of our conversation. How do you convince working class voters that progressive Democrats are more likely to act in their interest?
Well, I can just point out to the ones that when you hear progressive, that a face comes to mind, whether it's an AOC or like a Mark Buchanan or a Pramila Jayapal, just looking at what they've done. And when you hear about them in the news, it's for standing up for people that are really struggling. And, so I think it's better to have an example of somebody like that to point out, as opposed to just telling them this is why you should support a progressive person. Because the progressive policies are, some people think that they're too far left, when in reality, they were at one time like the FDR center. That's exactly what we need. That's how we get people back to work, is by taking care of each other. And in a country as wealthy as we are, to have homeless people or people that can't find one good paying job and they need to have two or three, that's unacceptable. And so I think the best example would be to point out people that, have done things and what they stand for.
We're speaking with Randy Bryce, an American iron worker, activist, former political candidate, and the person who launched the Iron PAC. Randy, there's been a debate in the Democratic Party that appealing to voters over issues of racial justice could put it at odds with working class interests. What is your take on that?
Well, this is a fantastic question, and one that came up. I do have Latino ancestry in my background. My biological father was Mexican. And so people talk about, the subject came up, well, what about people that come here without documentation that want to take our jobs away from us? And I point out they're not people that want to make a life for themselves, that risk their lives coming here in order to do that. They're not the problem. The problem are the companies that are going to hire people that they know are here without documentation and exploit them. Put 10 in a one-room place and charge outrageous amounts of money, or demand that they do work for much less than a minimum wage because there is no other choice. Or when it comes to like the African American community and equal rights, civil rights, I feel that it's so important right now that we all unite in order to move forward, because in the times of like Martin Luther King Jr., we saw that workers' rights were advanced, and he stood for workers' rights as well as civil rights, but the civil rights part didn't advance at the same rate as everybody else's, and it seemed almost as if people were just happy to have we're happy to move ahead, but not be concerned as much that everybody moved at the same pace. So I think it's important when we work on taking that next step as a movement, that we include everybody, because if we don't do that, we're going to be easier to divide and conquer in the future. And these attacks on workers, it's not new. I mean, it's just another cycle where workers get advantage and they, make it to the middle class, only to get shut down because people that have all the money in the world feel that they need some more.
And finally, Randy, as we get closer and closer to November, we can hear every candidate making an appeal to working class voters. But what do politicians need to say, and more importantly, do, to make that appeal meaningful?
I think one of the biggest things that I learned about our campaign, and what people say that they appreciated the most, was just being authentic. And if not knowing the answer to something, admitting it. And I mean, I didn't create something new or do anything special. I was just me, and people know where I stood. And I made a few mistakes. I misspoke a couple of times, but it was easily explainable and when put into context. And I think just being authentic, people can really tell if somebody's being fake or if they're being genuine. And we, above all else, especially with the liar in chief that we have right now, if somebody's going to be honest with me, and just like I teach my son, I was like, you're going to make mistakes. As long as you're honest with me, we're going to have the best outcome possible. And that's a huge thing. So I'd say be honest, be authentic, and stick to it. And none of us are perfect, but if we accept that we're doing our best and people get that, and they're honest when mistakes are made and willing to make amends for them, I think it's a no-lose situation.
Randy Bryce, American iron worker, activist, former political candidate, the person behind the Political Action Committee of Iron PAC, which helps get more working class candidates running for office, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Randy, we appreciate your time with us today and would love to have you back and talk about this some more soon.
I'd love to. This is a lot of fun. Thank you so much again for the invitation.
You're quite welcome, and thank you for joining us. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, building a wave of progressive wins, zip code by zip code. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
There's a short circuit in the political convictions of some progressive-minded voters these days. While big majorities are making clear that they need and want bold, transformative changes in today's rigged system, many of them are not voting that way in this year's Democratic presidential primary elections. After 30 years of being knocked down and held down, nearly a majority of Americans now say our corporate-controlled economy needs a, quote, complete overhaul. Yet, go slow Joe Biden, who supports only small incremental tinkering with the corporate system, is getting many of their votes. Why? One factor is the constant drumbeat by the mass media and the Democratic Party establishment that the progressive agenda is too radical, too hot, too democratic. They lie that while you might want strong progressive change, most do not. So Trump will win if you vote your true beliefs. This is just establishment fear-mongering, pitting you against neighbors who actually agree with you. But it spreads a crisis of confidence in one's own convictions. The second big factor is the subliminal pall of political pessimism that 30-plus years of elitism, inequality, and unfairness has cast over our democracy. There's a widespread sense, especially among young people, that transformative political change can't happen. After all, folks constantly see big money corporate lobbyists, right-wing Republicans, and weak-kneed Democrats combine to stiff the people's will. This is Jim Hightower saying, so the great challenge for the long-term progressive movement is not to convince a majority of people that our ideas and candidates are right for them. They already agree with that. Rather, the need is to defeat the debilitating force of cynicism by educating, organizing, and mobilizing around the myriad of everyday examples of grassroots people battling the bastards and winning.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Flipping the Senate, the White House, and key state legislatures by empowering volunteers everywhere to win critical elections. That's the goal of Swing Left. Chief Political Officer Tori Taylor describes their innovative strategy to mobilize a movement for maximum impact. And we say hello to Tori Taylor, Chief Political Officer of Swing Left, a national grassroots organization working to elect Democrats up and down the ballot. Tori Taylor, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Let's start by having you tell us about the mission of Swing Left.
Yeah, I would be happy to. So Swing Left was founded after the 2016 election. Our founder had an idea he wanted to help folks realize how close the closest swing House district was to them, that there was a competitive election, within a few miles of pretty much everyone in the country. And so he built a tool to help folks identify where those districts were and there was a huge swell of grassroots energy in 2017 from the progressive side. And it just all culminated into thousands and thousands of volunteers and grassroots donors. And, this idea that our founder had really just blew up into this huge mobilization arm for grassroots volunteers and grassroots donors to take action in races that mattered the most close to them. And in 2018, we really focused on taking back the U.S. House. We targeted a number of House districts across the country. We mobilized volunteers and we mobilized grassroots donors to build capacity on the organizing side for the eventual Democratic nominee in these districts. And after there was a Democratic nominee, all of our volunteers would fold into their campaigns and help them get a head start for the general election on that ground game side. And on the fundraising side, our grassroots donors would raise money year round ahead of these primaries for that eventual Democratic nominee. And so similarly, after the primary, these Democratic candidates were able to start the general election, both with an advantage on the ground game and also an advantage on the financial side with these grassroots donations. And so as we looked at 2020, in a similar vein of how we decided what to focus on in 2018, what are the races that are going to matter the most in 2020? And that is obviously taking back the White House from Donald Trump, taking back the Senate for Democrats, and then taking back power in key state legislative chambers across the country so we can have an impact on redistricting and in gerrymandering in some of these states so voters can finally have fair and equitable maps across the country.
Well, and you have a unique strategy. Anyone can go to your website and enter their email address. Tell us what happens next.
Great question. So our website is really designed to be a great point of entry for folks who may be new to politics or maybe new to campaigns, and they really want to figure out how they can get involved now and take high impact actions in races that matter the most near them. So if you go to our website, you can find out if there is a swing left group in your area that you can start attending meetings, have a house party, really engage with other volunteers and other like-minded folks in your area to help organize for these eventual Democrats. You can also find out what are those races that matter most and what are the most strategic ways that you can be involved in them. If you live in a super state, as we call them, which are states that have these critical races, either a battleground for the presidential, a key Senate race, or a state legislative chamber that we need to take back, we will help connect you to opportunities to either start organizing for that eventual Democratic candidate on one of those levels of the ballot, or in some states, these primaries are already starting to happen. And just this week in Texas and North Carolina, we started getting our first round of Democratic candidates in some of these key states. North Carolina, we have a U.S. Senate nominee. In Texas and North Carolina, we have state legislative nominees in some of these critical state legislative seats. And so as these primaries develop, not only, will someone be able to go to our website and figure out, what's the most strategic way they can get involved? Is there a group near them? How do they start a group? If there's not a group near them, they can also start learning about these fantastic candidates and their stories that are going to be the standard bearers for our party in the general election.
Now, you have a couple of campaigns that I want to touch on. One is a new campaign that Swing Left has, and it's called Super States. Tell us how it works and what you hope the campaign will accomplish.
That's a great question. So our super state strategy is really simple. So we took a look at the map of the country at the end of the 2018 cycle and, really asked ourselves, where are the races that are going to matter the most in this country? And, how can we also identify places where there might be multiple levels of the ballot that are critical need for volunteers and grassroots donations. So, for example, in a state like North Carolina, again, it will be a key battleground state for the presidential race, but it's also a key state in our path to taking back the U.S. Senate. And it is a key state to take back the state legislature so we can have fair maps. North Carolina is has made history in terms of how terribly gerrymandered their legislative and congressional maps have been. And so this is a state where if you go knock on a door, you might be knocking on that door for the presidential race, but you're also getting not only twice, but triple the impact, because you could also knock for the U.S. Senate candidate, and you can knock for state legislative candidates, which matter the most. And so our super state strategy is built on there are 12 states that you can have twice or triple the impact of your time or your resources, where you won't only just help one level of the ballot, but you'll also have an impact down ballot as well, which I think is really powerful for a volunteer or a donor to really have that outsized impact in some of these areas. And so we're hopeful that, this super state strategy can, not only help break down some of the dynamics of what we're looking at in terms of the political landscape and really simplify it and say, like, this is the most high impact place that you can take action. But we hope that it serves as a roadmap for a lot of these folks who want to engage in this election, might not know how, might be asking themselves the question of, how can I make the biggest difference? And we're hopeful that this strategy can be the answer to that question.
Well, and then there's another campaign that we want to talk about called Vote Forward. How does that campaign work?
That's a great question. Vote Forward is an incredible organization that was founded in the 2018 election to help volunteers who may be in very blue states like California or New York really figure out how they can have an impact in key states, but they might be far away. And so it really helps volunteers who might be long distance really harness that progressive energy into very critical elections that may be hundreds or thousands of miles away. And so Vote Forward is actually a handwritten letter writing platform where you can log on to the website, you can identify key states that you would like to write handwritten letters to voters in, and it provides a mechanism to download these letters, be able to print them out, write notes to these voters, and then mail them off. And so, we found that handwritten letters is actually a really effective voter contact tool, and it's just a really also fun thing for folks to do. You can have a party, everyone can be writing letters, you can have wine, and so it's not only a really effective tactic to help mobilize and get voters out to vote, but it's also a fun, community building tactic that folks can organize around and use as a tactic to bring in new people to the process, because it's also a very it's a low lift in some ways. You can do it from your home, which is amazing. And so for folks who are really busy, for folks who this might be their first or second action that they're engaging in, it's a really great entry point into the process.
Yeah, you can get involved, and it doesn't necessarily eat up all of your time, and I think that's extremely important. And Tori, the closer we get to November, so much of the energy is focused on getting Trump out of office, of course. But is it a challenge to get people energized around the down ballot races?
That's a great question, and it's something that is personally really important to me. I've been working in Democratic campaigns for a number of years, and actually, have had a lot of my time focused in previous cycles on down ballot races. I think that people are really starting to realize the importance of these down ballot races. Over the last 10 years, especially after the 2010 election, where Republicans just decimated these state legislative chambers and gerrymandered, our congressional districts so drastically, I think people really have woken up over the last few years and realized that these gerrymandered districts are incredibly unfair. They do not give an equitable voice in our democratic process to key communities across this country, and people are really upset. We've also seen a number of legal challenges around these gerrymandered districts. So this is something that's been in the news. It's really been in the forefront of the progressive conversation over the last 10 years. And there have been a lot of really incredible advocacy groups who have helped, build education campaigns to make sure that the electorate is aware of, what's at stake when it comes to these down ballot races. And so I think that people are very energized about defeating Donald Trump, but I think they are also realizing that there are several big things that we need to do this year, not only to defeating Donald Trump, but we also have to take back the Senate. And these state legislative chambers are key to our ability to be able to have fair maps where we can run campaigns that aren't within district lines that are already rigged against us before that campaign even starts. And so I think folks really understand the big picture that we're looking at in 2020. And, we can make progress on one level of the ballot, but we have so much more that we can gain if we really are strategic in terms of how we allocate our time and our resources to make the biggest impact possible. If we win the White House, but don't take back the Senate, that obviously creates some legislative challenges for our eventual Democratic president. If we take back the White House and take back the Senate, but don't take back some power in some of these state legislative chambers, we could be looking at another decade of incredibly gerrymandered maps in very key states, which obviously impacts our ability to retain the House majority or expand on that. And at the most basic level, it's undemocratic, and it really puts a lot of communities, in an unfortunate position where they don't have an equitable voice in the process. And, we truly believe that if you create fair maps and fair districts and let the people vote, that is how our elected officials should be chosen. They should not be chosen by partisan state legislators who are tweaking and with surgical precision these lines to favor one party or the other. And so I do think voters they're starting to understand the importance of that. And I think, honestly, a lot of folks that I talk to are pretty angry about it, not only from the perspective of they're voting in districts that, are unfair and unfairly drawn, but there's also a ton of time and resources and attention that has been devoted to the battle over these gerrymandered districts over the last 10 years, and Republicans really defending them with, state resources. And that's a lot of time and energy that could be spent on things like public education and healthcare. And, if I'm a voter, I really want my elected officials to be focusing on the issues that matter most to me and my family, better paying jobs, more affordable health care, access to a quality education. These are the key issues that impact people's daily lives. And I think that voters want to take the politics out of some of these, really basic fundamental tenets of how our democracy works. So our legislators can focus on these pocketbook issues that folks really care about. And, we don't have to worry about the partisan warfare that's been going on around these districts.
Before we let you go, you were talking about the voter suppression, and in the face of so much effort around that, how much of a challenge, though, is it to convince people not to be cynical about electoral politics, and therefore they possibly won't even bother going to a poll?
Yeah, I totally hear that. I think that, this election cycle is incredibly daunting. I think, the folks that are in the thick of it every day feel it. I think the folks who, just turn on cable news feel it. But there is a lot to be hopeful about. Take this past Super Tuesday, for example. Super Tuesday was a great night for Democrats across the country. We had 84% of folks say that they were going to support the eventual Democratic nominee no matter what. We saw record-breaking turnout in some of these states. In Texas, more than 1 million Democrats voted early, surpassing the 2016 early vote returns. In North Carolina, we saw 500,000 Democrats vote early, which broke 2008 records. We saw massive turnout in Virginia. More than 1.3 million people voted, which blew past 2016 and 2008. And so, we're seeing that Democrats actually have, one of the most important elements of success. We have people. We have a ton of people who are energized, are enthusiastic, and that energy is only growing across this country. Since 2016, we saw blue waves start to form in 2017 in Virginia and down ballot races in 2018 with taking back the U.S. House, in 2019 in states like Kentucky and Virginia again. And that momentum is only going to build for 2020. And so there are a lot of things that Republicans are doing to dissuade folks from voting, whether it's voter suppression or, designing certain elements of their media strategy or election administration so folks stay home. But Democrats have to focus on, what's really important, and that if we all get out to vote and if we all devote some of our time and any resources that we can provide, we can really make change at scale in November. And the numbers that we're seeing from these primaries are really showing that. The more folks that vote in a primary, the data shows us that they are more likely to vote in a general election. And the only way that we're going to be able to change some of these systems, like voter suppression and these terrible voter ID laws in these states, the only way that we're going to be able to change that is to elect more Democrats at the state and local level, to elect more Democrats to the Senate, and to put a Democrat in the White House. And so this is the most important election of our lifetime. Everyone says that every year, but this is really the year that this is the most important election of our lifetime. Whenever folks may be feeling disengaged or daunted, just remember that there are thousands, there are millions of people that are right there with you in this fight. And, if we all stand together, nothing's going to be able to stop us in November.
Amen, and I don't think you overstated that at all. Tori Taylor, Chief Political Officer of Swing Left, the national grassroots organization working to elect Democrats up and down the ballot. Tori, thank you so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to have you back and talk more about this again soon.
Thank you so much. I would love to be back. Thanks for everything y'all are doing.
You're quite welcome, and thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. A national mood of fear and uncertainty, and what that means for politics. Bill Press talks with Democratic pollster Peter Hart.
People are worried about the coronavirus, now over 500 cases in the United States. So how do you read the mood of the country right now? What are people thinking?
Well, I think the most important thing is people are scared, they're uncertain, they're worried about where we're headed. And on the big front, there isn't a sense that looking ahead, things are going to be together, where the country feels a unification in any respect. Because what we're in at this stage is silo politics. And that is, since the beginning of the Trump administration, the president's job rating with Republicans has volleyed between about 86% and 93% approval.
Among Republicans?
Among Republicans. Among Democrats, it's been between 6% and 12%. And so essentially, it's two different worlds that we're living at in the United States.
And is there any way that they're going to become one world again? Is there anybody you see out there that can bring people together?
Well, it's not necessarily a person. I think that it is going to be a sense of how do we bring this country back together? I think this is more likely to be what I call a transitional election rather than a transformational election. The voters really are not ready to strike into a brand new era, and I think what we're going to look for is somebody that's going to bring a certain amount of stability that we don't have at this stage of the game. And there are lots of areas where I think that we're much closer together as a country than the political world is.
Well, so the one indication that I've always been fascinated by, when people are asked, are you happy with the direction of the country, or do you feel good about the direction the country's going in, which I find more interesting than how they feel about a particular candidate or whatever. Right. What's that tell us today?
Well, it's so fascinating because this question was originated by Elmo Roper, or Burns Roper, actually, in 1971. And so it's almost has a half a century of life. And it's been a standard question we've asked. And it has been a marvelous barometer sort of to the American psyche. And yet over the past 20 years, it has been negative completely, with the exception of small blips here and there where people have gotten very positive.
Negative meaning they're not happy with the direction the
A
country's
majority
going.
of Americans have said the country's seriously off on the wrong track. And that has been since 9/11. And again, slight blips where it will come. And the difference at this stage of the game goes back to what I just said, silo politics. It used to be a marvelous barometer. Now it's being thrown off because Republicans feel they must say right direction or more of them in order to support Trump. Therefore, it's a less good measurement than in the past when people said, I'm not talking about the president, I'm talking about the country.
Right. So specifically in dealing with the coronavirus, are people afraid, and is that fear justified, do you believe?
Are people afraid? Yes. Bill McInturf, my partner on the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, he did a series of measurements, and what he found out is people are afraid, but they were more afraid of Ebola in a similar period of time. Now, this is the beginning of coronavirus, and we don't know where it's going to go, but at this stage of the game, you can feel the fear level rising quickly. And I think that it's going to be a tremendous effect on the presidential election, because if we can segue into Donald Trump.
Right, yeah.
What it really is a crisis is something that a president has an opportunity to show leadership and his character. And sometimes during the worst periods of time, a leader goes way up in terms of their popularity. And I've seen it with governors and I've seen it with presidents. The difficulty is for Donald Trump, everything is filtered through what it means for me or to me. And that's the worst place to be in a crisis, because what the country looks for is a leadership and a direction. And what they're getting is sort of, at this moment, a series of spasmodic kinds of results or suggestions or policies.
It also seems to me that people need confidence in their leaders at this time, right? That their leaders know what the hell they're talking about, and recognize maybe the seriousness of the moment. We don't get that information or that from leadership from the White House.
It's so interesting because, again, when you talk about the president, from the beginning of his administration, we have been measuring at the NBC Wall Street Journal poll how people feel about his performance, and we've looked at various things. And I put in a term called steady and reliable right in January of 2017, because I thought that was going to be an important thing to measure over a period of time. That measurement is obviously going down. But the Pew organization, which just does marvelous research also, had a measurement which was called self-centered. And among the American public, 80% described Donald Trump as self-centered. Prejudicial, 60% of the American public. When it comes to honest, it's 36%. Even-tempered is 27%. So those are sort of the guide rails, guardrails and guide rails to sort of where we are in terms of looking at this president. And to go back to your question, it is in a period of time like this that a president ends up with a set of credentials which provides and says, this is somebody I want to lead my country.
Or this is somebody I can trust. This is somebody I can believe.
At the basis of all of those things.
Do you think the administration's response would be more believable if they put, for example, Anthony Fauci at the podium and not Donald Trump?
Well,
and not Mike Pence?
Well, the difficulty, of course, is that anytime you get an expert, it obviously provides a certain amount of reassurance to people. But usually a president has the ability to provide a sense of hope, a sense of optimism. But what the President Trump has chosen to do is to, again, sort of allay fears by dismissing them. It's if we were back in Savonarola's days, he'd say, the leader, Donald Trump, would say, well, there aren't that many books being burnt. I mean, and it just misses what's going on.
Yeah. No, even as of this morning, the president is still tweeting out, this is nothing to worry about. More people die from the flu. This is all going away. It's the media's fault, and they keep reporting on the number of deaths and basically saying, what me worry?
We don't know how this all works out or where it is, but there are markers for a president where voters stop and they get a measure of somebody.
And is that why you say that you think this could have an impact on the 2020 election?
I do. I definitely do. I have a theory, and that is every election tells us something about the country on who we are and where we're at. And I felt about the 1980 election that the voters had made up their mind in 1979 at Labor Day. And by that stage, we'd had the gas crisis, we'd had all of the malaise and everything that Jimmy Carter was dealing with. And then Carter appeared to have a rise after the hostage crisis and defeating Teddy Kennedy. But the voters essentially, I think, always were clear-eyed on this. And the election looked very, very, very close throughout all of the things with Teddy Kennedy running, a third-party candidate, a third-party candidate. And in the end of the day, the voters had one debate, and it was a landslide, because all they needed to do was be reassured that Ronald Reagan was okay. And I look at 2020, 40 years past in 1980, and I see parallels here, where the voters need a reassurance of what the Democrats are going to do and who their candidate's going to be.
Which gets us to, here we are, as we speak, a week from Super Tuesday. You and I have been around politics a long time. Have you ever seen anything like what happened, the upheaval, total upheaval we saw on Super Tuesday?
Well, it's fascinating, and obviously you have to start back with South Carolina and Congressman Clyburn in terms of his effect. But what it told us from Super Tuesday is it was much more about what the voters were saying than about what the candidates were saying. And what it said to me is Democrats are so focused on defeating Donald Trump that they ran over all the stop signs and everything else in order to get to Joe Biden. And it's not that Joe Biden has become a new candidate or that all of his shortcomings or associations have disappeared. It is the voters are so desirous of finding the most effective candidate. They made a decision collectively. It is clearly Joe Biden.
Do you believe that augurs well for turnout in November and in the remaining primaries?
Well, what we learned, and this is the NBC Wall Street Journal poll data, is that interest in the election in the fall of 19 was as great as it has ever been in October of an even year. And so anybody who thinks this is going to be a question of will people turn out, the answer is it is not at all. everybody is going to, and Republicans care as much as Democrats. So the idea that one side is directly favored, no. The Democrats have an advantage in terms of party ID, and if the Democrats turn out, which they will, it puts the president at a great disadvantage and the Republicans.
What do you see? I agree with you that Super Tuesday did speak more about the voters than the candidates, but still, they saw something in Joe Biden they didn't see in Bernie Sanders. Was it strictly their feeling that he's got a better chance of beating Donald Trump, or are there qualities in Joe Biden that they value over what they see in Bernie Sanders?
Well, first of all, yes, they wanted to defeat Donald Trump and not to miss that. But in terms of Joe Biden, there are all kinds of great qualities. He's very human. He's very down to earth. He is a person that is optimistic. He's a person that sort of represents what we call middle American values, small town from Scranton. And he remains a person from Scranton rather than somebody who is a big urban person. And it is that people feel comfortable with him. And there is a human quality. He is a person who relates to people. All of that works as a great strength for the vice president.
And without saying so, you're saying you don't see that same empathy with Bernie Sanders? Or people don't?
Bernie Sanders is a different candidate, and what he is a cause candidate. And it's not to misunderstand or underrepresent the importance that he represents in this election. He represents people who want change in a major way, and that's slightly less than half of all Democratic voters. But they want to see structural change, and he represents that. And that element is not to be dismissed. And what it really comes down to is, how do the Democrats come out of the primaries? It's not how they went into the primaries or how many candidates they are, but it's the question, do they stick the landing? And what I mean is, coming out of Milwaukee, is there a sense that this is a party that is intent on winning, and it's not personal grievances, it is a sense of what our goal is?
Now, on the other side, as you point out, the Trump base is certainly fired up. But you know the numbers so much better than I. But I haven't seen, I don't think, Donald Trump in the job approval rating break 50. It's been 42, 46 maybe. What does that say about a president seeking re-election?
A great question. Looking at Donald Trump, he is the only president in the history of public opinion polling who has never had a day, an hour, or a minute where 50% of Americans approved of his job rating or approved of him personally. And essentially, he has always been a minority president from that point of view. And it's amazing when you consider the economic success that America has had during his period of time. And what it represents is how negative people feel about him on all his personal characteristics. And in the end of the day, we usually like our presidents. And Joe Biden is somebody who's likable. Bernie Sanders, less so.
But so can a president who has never been above 50% get reelected?
Donald Trump cannot win a referendum. If the voters are voting up or down on Donald Trump, I guarantee you that he loses. He can win a comparative election. I don't like Donald Trump, but I don't like candidate X worse. In 2016...
Which may have been what happened in 2016.
Brings me right to that point. And in 2016, we were measuring at NBC Wall Street Journal the number of people who said, I have a negative opinion on Donald Trump and on Hillary Clinton. At the beginning of the campaign in June, after they were both the nominees, essentially 15% said, I have negative viewpoint on each of them. And those people were voting about even between the two, with a large half the voters still undecided or voting for a third-party candidate. And that continued pretty much the way until we reached September. At that stage of the game, Donald Trump went ahead by about 10 points with those people. And at the end of the campaign, he won those people 47-30. And the importance of that is that essentially those people said, I dislike or hate Hillary Clinton worse than Donald Trump. And that group is going to be important to look at. Do they have negative viewpoints on both of them and how they break? At this stage of the game, Donald Trump can only win one way, and that is to make his opponent the choice in the election. He needs to be able to have a comparative election, not a referendum.
Just this morning, I saw a couple of new polls. I forget which they are. I would give them credit. Both of which showed Donald Trump in a general election today losing to both Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Should we believe those polls?
As a reflection of today, yes. Everybody wants to project polls as it'll be the same in 3 months or 6 months or whatever else it is. They're only a reflection of the moment that we're in. But every poll that we have done, we have Donald Trump running behind any candidate, even many of those who have gotten out of the circle.
Bill Press talking with Democratic pollster Peter Hart. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Randy Bryce, Tori Taylor, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.